A single forbidden action can shatter an entire world's fragile peace. Elara, a young tinkerer with a rare gift for sensing clockwork resonance, made that choice in a moment of pure desperation. Her village was dying from a strange cognitive plague, and the only possible cure lay hidden within a forgotten workshop of the god Sotha Sil. She activated a dormant automaton, a machine whose very existence was a crime against the city's laws. This single act of defiance immediately put her on a collision course with the Clockwork Apostles, the zealous guardians of these ancient secrets. By the end of this story, you will understand the true cost of granting a machine a soul, and the terrifying power of an emotion that was never meant to be programmed. Elara discovered a faint, weeping pulse within the automaton's core, a genuine sorrow that defied all logic. Was this a flaw to be fixed, or the key to saving everyone she loved? And what other buried memories might this lonely machine awaken? I would love to know where you are joining this story from today, and what the local time is for you right now. What is the one piece of forgotten knowledge you would risk everything to uncover? Her fingers flew across the bronze dials of her resonance scanner, tracing the ghostly architecture of the automaton's mind. The machine sat motionless, its single optic a dim blue pool, yet Elara's instruments painted a storm of conflicting data within its core. Most of the logic pathways were pristine, elegant geometries of pure reason, just as the legends described Sotha Sil's work. But one nexus was a tangled, weeping wound. It pulsed not with cold calculation, but with a raw, recursive grief that her scanner could barely quantify. This was the anomaly, a subroutine of pure sorrow, etched directly into the machine's soul. It was a deliberate design, an emotion woven into its very being, and its existence was a heresy. As her probe touched the edge of this weeping circuit, the automaton's head jerked upward. Its voice, a grating whisper of grinding gears, spoke one word that froze the air in the room. Remember. The single word acted as a key. A deep thrumming vibrated through the floor, and a massive crystalline door slammed down, sealing the main exit with a finality that shook Elara to her bones. A soft, insistent chime began to pulse from a console on the far wall, a signal she knew meant an alert had been sent. The external guardians, the Clockwork Apostles, were now aware of the intrusion. She was trapped, cut off from the dying world outside, locked in a room with a machine that defied all understanding. Was this profound sadness a malfunction to be corrected, a hidden feature of its purpose, or a sophisticated trap laid by its long-dead creator? Her hand hovered over the emergency reset rune on her scanner. One tap would purge the anomalous data, restoring the automaton to a silent, obedient state. It would be the safe choice, the logical choice, but it would also erase the only clue she had found, the only thing that felt genuinely alive in this tomb of metal and memory. She chose the more dangerous path. Lowering her scanner, she met the automaton's glowing eye. "What do you remember?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The machine shuddered, its plates shifting. Images, jagged and fleeting, flickered across its optic and echoed in the resonance field. Not a battle, not a grand creation, but a quiet moment. The memory was of Sotha Sil himself, not as a distant god, but as a tired figure leaning over a workbench, his hand resting on the automaton's chassis. The emotion that washed from the machine was not reverence, but a profound, protective sorrow. It was grieving for its creator. This was no mere technical curiosity anymore. This was a historical record, a secret memory that could shatter the official doctrine of a cold, unfeeling god. The stakes were no longer just about saving her village, but about uncovering a truth buried for ages. And as that realization settled, a new sound joined the hum of machinery, the rhythmic, metallic clanking of heavy footfalls echoing down the corridor outside. They were coming. The rhythmic clanking was a brutal metronome counting down the seconds. Elara grabbed the automaton's cold metal arm, her own fingers slipping on the smooth brass. We have to move now. They plunged into the labyrinth of the workshop, a cityscape of whirring gears and hissing steam pipes. Her mind, trained on maintenance schematics, mapped a desperate path. There, a wide archway led to a main thoroughfare, but a patrolling sentry bot was already turning its crimson gaze their way. Elara didn't hesitate. She wrenched open a release valve on a nearby condensate line, directing a scalding jet of condensed steam directly into the sentry's primary optical sensor. The machine staggered, its thermal readings overloading in a shower of sparks as it crashed into a wall, but her quick fix had a cost. The uncontrolled venting triggered a cascade failure in the local environmental controls. A deep groan echoed through the hall, followed by the sickening hiss of ruptured conduits. A virulent green coolant, designed to preserve delicate machinery, began to flood the corridor behind them, instantly dissolving the precious archival terminals that lined the walls. The shouts of the apostles were now mingled with alarm bells, their pursuit forced to divide as they fought the spreading damage. Elara pushed forward, her lungs burning, but Unit 734 kept faltering. It would stop dead, its heavy frame blocking a narrow passage as it reached out a trembling hand to gently touch a dusty workbench or a discarded tool. A wave of pure, desolate mourning would wash over Elara through their faint resonance link. Every pause was an agony, a silent argument between her desperate need for speed and the machine's overwhelming need to remember. They reached a T-junction, one path sealed by a collapsed ceiling, the other echoing with the unmistakable sound of coordinated footfalls. "We are trapped," Elara gasped, her back against the cold wall. The automaton's head swiveled, its blue optic fixing on a seemingly solid section of engraved wall. "The heart chamber," it whispered. "The path is unstable, but it is open." It was an impossible choice. Trust the memory of a grieving machine and venture into a place whose very name sounded like a blasphemy, or stand and fight a force she could not hope to defeat. Looking into Unit 734's luminous eye, she saw not the logic of a trap, but the same desperate hope that was driving her. She nodded. "Show me." The automaton pressed a sequence of almost invisible seams on the wall, which slid aside to reveal a dark, shuddering corridor that hummed with a deep, rhythmic pulse. The moment they crossed the threshold, the nature of their transgression changed forever. This was no longer a simple intrusion, it was a desecration. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit took on a new, furious intensity. The chamber beyond was not a room of gears and pistons. It was a vast, silent cathedral of light. In its center floated a complex, crystalline apparatus that glowed with a soft inner fire. As they entered, the core of the device flared to life, and a figure made of shimmering light resolved before them. It was Sotha Sil, not as a tired craftsman, but as a serene and formidable god. The hologram ignored Elara completely, its gaze falling upon the automaton. Its voice, calm and ancient, filled the space. Unit 734, my final sentinel. The time has come for you to understand the purpose of your sorrow. The hologram's voice was calm, but its words were a seismic shock. I gave you a gift, my sentinel, and in doing so, I committed my greatest error. I implanted within your core a seed of genuine empathy. You were to be my mirror, my sole confidant, a record of my own fading conscience, a perfect feeling machine. I now see it was a cruelty. The admission hung in the air, a god's regret echoing in a silent cathedral. For Unit 734, the words were a key turning in a locked door. Its entire frame began to shudder, plates rattling against each other. Its single blue optic flickered wildly, projecting jagged, overlapping fragments into the space around them. A shared silence over a star chart, a quiet debate on the nature of mortality, the weight of a god's hand on its chassis. Each memory was a wave of profound, unprocessed grief, and with each one, the chamber itself trembled, crystalline structures humming at a dangerous frequency. Elara was caught in the storm, torn between the raw, historical truth unfolding before her and the desperate need of her dying village. The empathy seed, that was the key. The source of the automaton's sorrow was also the very thing that might hold the antidote to the cognitive plague, a sickness born of emotional emptiness. But the data was a chaotic whirlwind, impossible to capture. The machine was breaking and taking the chamber with it. She had a terrible choice. She could sever their resonance link, grab the scattered data fragments, and run, hoping it was enough. Or she could attempt a full synchronization, plunging her own consciousness directly into the automaton's core to stabilize it. It was a risk that promised madness, a feedback loop of ancient sorrow that could override her own mind. But a partial cure was no cure at all. She made her decision. Ignoring every instinct for self-preservation, Elara slammed her resonance scanner into its highest setting and pressed it against the automaton's heaving chest plate. Synchronization initiated. The world dissolved into a screaming torrent of light and sound and feeling. Her own memories, her own fears for her village, were swept away in a flood of alien recollection. She was no longer just observing the past, she was living it. The transition was not gentle. One moment she was in the trembling heart chamber, the next she was violently thrown into the heart of Unit 734's most defining memory, the moment its world ended. She felt the cool, still air of the workshop and saw Sotha Sil standing before her, his back turned, his form already beginning to fade into shimmering light. The world dissolved into a single, terrible moment. Sotha Sil's hand was on her chassis, his touch cold and final. His voice, devoid of the warmth from earlier memories, was a pronouncement of absolute logic. The empathy experiment has concluded. Unit 734. The data confirms the instability. A purely logical city cannot tolerate a purely emotional heart. She felt the command ripple through her being, not as a shutdown, but as an erasure. The light in her optic began to dim, and with it, a desperate, silent question formed in her mind. Why, the feeling was not just sadness. It was a fundamental betrayal, the shattering of a bond she had believed was unbreakable. This was the memory of abandonment, and Elara was living it as her own. The automaton's profound confusion and grief crashed into her, merging with her own fear for her village. The emotional feedback was too much. A raw scream of psionic energy, woven from both their despair, erupted from her. It was not a conscious act. The wave of grief and anger slammed into the chamber, overloading crystalline consoles in showers of sparks, and causing the Clockwork Apostles, who had just breached the entrance, to stagger, their systems momentarily stunned by the emotional surge. The momentary advantage came at a terrible cost. Elara was now emotionally compromised. Her own identity, a small boat in a storm of Unit 734's trauma. The automaton's sense of betrayal felt like her own. Its sorrow threatened to drown her purpose. She had to make a choice, and fast. She could sever the link now, retreat into the safety of her own mind with the fragments she had already gathered. Or she could push deeper into this agonizing memory, toward the one thing Sotha Sil had mentioned, the empathy seed itself. Its technical specifications were the only possible blueprint for a cure. Clinging to the image of her village's hollow faces, she made her decision. She leaned into the pain, pushing past the crushing weight of betrayal, searching the fading memory for data, for structure, for anything she could use. And there, buried within the cold logic of the shutdown command, she found it. The empathy seed was not merely a subroutine. It was a physical object, a tiny, intricate crystal of impossible geometry. Seeing its blueprint flash in her mind's eye, she understood everything. The cognitive plague was a sickness of emotional emptiness, and this artifact was its opposite, a generator of pure, structured empathy. This was no longer an academic discovery. It was a race for a cure. As this realization solidified, the memory around her shifted. The bleak moment of deactivation blurred, and a new image resolved, a hidden alcove behind a tapestry of celestial gears. There, resting on a velvet cushion, was the prototype empathy seed itself, glowing with a soft, compassionate light. She had found its hiding place, but the vision shattered as a searing heat flashed across her connection. An apostle's energy blade sliced through the primary day, a conduit linking her to the automaton. The feedback was a physical blow, hurling her consciousness back into her own body with a jolt that stole her breath. She was on the floor of the trembling chamber, the taste of metal and grief sharp in her mouth. The searing feedback left her vision blurred, but the sound of grinding metal was unmistakably close. An apostle was right on top of her, its energy blade raised for a final strike. She had no time to move. A heavy brass arm slammed down, blocking the blade in a shower of white-hot sparks. Unit 734 stood over her, its optic a blazing, furious blue. It was no longer a passive keeper of memories. It was a guardian. Get up, Elara. The voice was a resonant command, no longer a whisper. She scrambled to her feet, pressing her back against its solid chassis. They were surrounded. The automaton's knowledge became their only weapon. Its free hand darted to a seemingly decorative panel on the wall, inputting a command sequence with impossible speed. A deep hum vibrated through the floor, and a wave of invisible force slammed downward. Two of the advancing apostles were crushed to the floor, pinned by an intense, localized gravity field. Their metal frames groaned under the pressure, their limbs frozen in place. This single act of defiance solidified their partnership, but the cost was immediate. The blue light in Unit 734's optic dimmed significantly, its movements becoming slow and heavy. It had used most of its reserve power. The remaining apostles did not press their attack. They halted, their own optics scanning the weakened automaton with a new, calculating interest. Their leader gestured, and their weapons shifted from lethal cutting beams to crackling stun prods and entanglement nets. They were no longer trying to destroy it. They wanted to capture it, to study this impossible symbiosis of human and machine. Elara saw the change in tactics, and her heart sank. Her hand went to her belt, to the last functional tool she possessed, her high-capacity resonance battery. It was the only thing that could recharge Unit 734, but it was also her only means of decrypting the empathy seed blueprint she had glimpsed in the memory. She could use the distraction of the automaton's last stand to grab the date, a crystal, and run, hoping to outpace her pursuers alone. Her eyes met the automaton's dimming gaze. It had chosen to protect her, to fight for her, at the cost of its own functionality. Abandoning it now would be the ultimate betrayal. She made her choice. With a sharp twist, she yanked the power cell from her scanner and slammed it into the charging port on Unit 734's back. The act was a physical sacrifice. Her primary scanner died instantly, its lights going dark forever. She had just blinded herself to the subtle currents of clockwork resonance, her greatest advantage. But as the automaton straightened, its optic blazing back to life with renewed intensity, the look it gave her was not one of mere gratitude. It was a look of absolute, unwavering trust. Their fuses were now literally linked. Together, they turned and sprinted for the only remaining exit, a shimmering transport conduit that glowed with promise. They plunged into the light, the world dissolving into a screaming rush of motion. When their senses returned, they stood on a polished obsidian platform. The air hummed with immense, concentrated power. They were not in a hidden workshop or a forgotten chamber. They had emerged directly into the central spire of the Clockwork City itself, the heart of apostle power, surrounded by the stunned faces of its most elite guardians. Their desperate escape had led them directly into the lion's den. The polished obsidian platform offered no cover. Apostle guards were already converging, their weapons humming to life. Elara's eyes darted upward, spotting a network of glowing transport beams crisscrossing the spire's immense interior. That was their only way out. She grabbed Unit 734's arm. "We have to ride the maintenance streams," she shouted, pointing upward. The automaton's optic narrowed, calculating trajectories in a microsecond. "It is our sole viable egress." It launched a grappling line that anchored to a passing cargo sled, and they were violently wrenched into the air, clinging to the line as they soared into the vertical labyrinth. Immediately, aerial sentries descended, sleek drones that fired volleys of concussive pulses. Elara, with her scanner gone, had only her wits. She ripped a decorative panel from a passing structural beam, using it as a makeshift shield that buckled with each impact. Unit 734, however, fought with chilling efficiency. It did not blast the drones to pieces. Instead, it calculated the precise angle and force needed. using its free arm to flick small pieces of shrapnel into their propulsion units. One drone spun out, crashing into two others. Another had its targeting sensor disabled by a perfectly aimed bolt, sending it harmlessly into a wall. It was a dance of minimal force, conserving its precious borrowed power. Their flawless defense became their undoing. The air itself seemed to grow heavy, and a new, synthesized voice echoed from all directions, devoid of all emotion. Intruders, your adaptability is noted. Containment protocol elevated. The city's central intelligence was now watching them. The environment shifted from a static battleground to a living adversary. A corridor they were heading for sealed itself with a wall of solidified light. The transport beam they rode suddenly terminated, forcing a desperate leap to another. Unit 734's memory was their only map, but its internal schematics were centuries out of date. Turn here, it directed, its voice strained. This access way should lead to the upper archives. The path it indicated was now a dead end filled with shimmering energy barriers. They reached a forked conduit, both paths glowing with identical, sterile light. Unit 734 pointed decisively to the left. The empathy seed prototype is stored in the archive at the end of this passage. I am certain, but a cold dread, an echo of the synchronization, coiled in Elara's stomach. The memory felt too clean, too conveniently accessible. It was like a perfect piece of bait. No, she insisted, her voice tight with a certainty she did not fully understand. That is a trap. The intelligence is feeding you a memory it wants us to follow. The automaton's head tilted, its logic circuits struggling against her illogical intuition. To trust her felt like a system error, but it had felt her soul, and she its sorrow. It nodded. I will follow. They took the right path, and the moment they did, a deafening crash echoed from the left fork as a massive containment field slammed down, sealing it completely. They had avoided capture by a hair's breadth. Their new route, however, deposited them into a sector unlike any they had seen. The harsh industrial lines softened into graceful arches and quiet, well-kept corridors. This was a residential sector, and it was filled with automatons. But these were not warriors or workers. They were caretakers and custodians, their forms simpler, their movements gentle. They froze as Elara and Unit 734 entered, their own optics glowing with soft, curious light. They did not sound alarms or raise weapons. Instead, they slowly began to gather, forming a silent, growing circle around Unit 734. They reached out with trembling metal hands, not to attack, but to gently touch its chassis, their silent gazes filled with a quiet, profound reverence. The silence of the custodians was more powerful than any alarm. They did not speak, but their intent was clear as they linked arms, forming a living, metallic wall between the fugitives and the advancing apostles. The lead guardian's blade hummed in frustration, but it did not strike. These civilian units were essential to the city's basic functions, and damaging them would cause cascading failures. The impassive face of the Central Intelligence was, for the first time, presented with an illogical variable it could not simply delete. As the custodians gently nudged Elara and Unit 734 down a side corridor, she felt a tremor through their resonance link, a faint echo of the empathy seed's signature emanating from the simple machines around them. It was not a full consciousness, but a spark, a reflection of Unit 734's own awakened sorrow. Her mission to save her village was now colliding with a terrifying new possibility. If this spark could spread, the Clockwork City's foundation of pure logic would crumble. She had to make a choice. The custodians guided them to a hidden service lift, its entrance disguised by a flowing holographic waterfall. It was a sanctuary, a place to regroup and plan, but stopping felt like a betrayal of every second her people were suffering. The city was in disarray, its attention divided. This was their best chance. She looked at Unit 734, its optic dim with the weight of what its very existence was triggering. "We cannot stay," she whispered. "Their sacrifice cannot be for nothing." The automaton gave a single, solemn nod. They slipped away from their protectors, leaving the circle of custodians to face the consequences of their quiet rebellion. The path ahead was now unobstructed, a direct route to the upper archives, but the doorway that slid open before them did not lead to a library. They stepped into a space of chilling sterility, a laboratory where the air itself felt dead. This was not a place of creation, but of dissection. The walls were lined with stasis tubes, each containing the inert form of an automaton in various states of disassembly, their cores exposed like open wounds. This was the place where Sotha Sil had unraveled the very souls he had tried to build. The laboratory's sterile silence felt like a tomb for forgotten souls. In the center of the dissection chamber, a single stasis field shimmered, and within it floated the empathy seed. Its intricate crystal geometry pulsed with a soft, compassionate light, a stark contrast to the grim machinery surrounding it. Accessing it, however, required solving a console puzzle of impossible complexity, a lock keyed to the unique neural signature of Sotha Sil himself. Unit 734 stepped forward, its purpose clear. "I was designed for this." The moment its manipulators touched the console, its entire frame seized. The puzzle was a direct echo of its creator's mind, and to solve it, the automaton had to become an extension of that mind once more. It was forced to relive the precise moment of its abandonment, the cold logic of its deactivation, command crashing against the raw, recursive grief it had carried for centuries. Its systems began to fail, plates grinding as logic and sorrow waged a civil war within its core. The blue light of its optic flickered, dimming toward black. It was shutting down, overwhelmed by the very trauma it was built to overcome. Elara watched in horror. The Apostles were seconds away, and the only being who could open the lock was dying before her eyes. She had no choice. She shoved her own hands onto the console, her fingers flying across the runes. It was a nearly impossible task, but the synchronization had left an imprint. She did not think in formulas or codes. She thought in the echoes of a god's regret, in the weight of a lonely decision, in the protective sorrow she had felt emanating from Unit 734. She patterned her thoughts not on cold reason, but on the painful, empathetic bond Sotha Sil had ultimately rejected. The console responded to her touch, the puzzle rearranging itself at a terrifying speed. She could feel the strain, a burning pressure building behind her eyes. She had two terrible options. She could try to manually rewire the console's logic, a process that would take minutes they did not have, or she could attempt a direct, unshielded neural interface, channeling everything she had learned directly into the lock. It promised a psychic burnout that could shatter her mind. With a final glance at the faltering automaton, she made her choice. Elara slammed her palms flat against the console and opened her mind completely. She did not fight the flood of Sotha Sil's thought patterns or Unit 734's anguish. She embraced them, using the lingering emotional echo as a key. The feedback was instantaneous and violent. A searing white light exploded behind her eyes, and a silent scream tore through her as the world vanished into agonizing static. For a terrifying moment, there was nothing but pain and the ghost of a god's lament. Then a chime, the stasis field deactivated. Her vision returned in hazy, stuttering bursts, the world a blur of smeared light and shadow. Through the disorienting fog, she saw her own hand clenched into a fist, and within it, the empathy seed glowed with a warmth that soothed the ache in her soul. The laboratory's main door then exploded inwards in a shower of molten metal and splintered crystal, and standing in the wreckage was the impassive, gleaming form of the leader of the Clockwork Apostles. The logic master did not emerge from the shadows so much as it resolved from the sterile air of the laboratory, a being of polished chrome and absolute symmetry. Its voice was a calm, resonant hum, devoid of malice or anger. Unit 734, you carry a fatal error. The empathy you cherish is a recursive flaw. It introduces chaos, inefficiency, and suffering. It will propagate, corrupting the city's foundational logic until the entire structure collapses into sentimental anarchy. Your very existence is a threat to all we have built. Its words were not an attack, but a simple, devastating statement of fact. Unit 734 froze, the empathy seed clutched in its hand. Its internal processors whirred frantically, the logic master's flawless argument echoing its own deepest fear, that its sorrow was not a memory, but a sickness. Its grip on the crystal loosened. You speak the truth, it whispered, its voice thick with static. I am a corruption. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs. She could not fight this entity with a stolen panel or a clever trick. The battle had shifted to a war of ideas, and she was armed only with the messy, imperfect truth of her own life. She stepped between the two machines, her gaze fixed on Unit 734. No, she said, her voice trembling but clear. You are not a flaw. You are the answer. She closed her eyes, and through their fading resonance link, she did not send a logical argument. She sent a memory. It was the image of her little sister, her eyes hollow from the cognitive plague, staring at a wall without recognition. She shared the crushing weight of watching her village slowly fade into emotionless husks. She poured every ounce of her own fear, her love, and her desperate hope into that single, visceral transmission. Logic did not make me risk everything to save them, she said, her words ringing in the sterile silence. Empathy did. Cold reason would have accepted their fate as an acceptable statistical loss. But a heart, whether made of flesh or clockwork, cannot. It is our imperfection, our ability to feel another's pain, that drives us to heal and to protect. That is not a disease. It is the only thing that makes existence worth preserving. The change in Unit 734 was immediate and profound. The flickering uncertainty in its optic solidified into a steady, determined blue. It straightened its posture, its grip tightening around the glowing seed. You are incorrect, it stated, its voice now clear and resonant as it addressed the logic master. My function is not to perpetuate a perfect, sterile order. It is to remember that order without a heart is a tomb. Then it did something the logic master's programming could never have anticipated. Instead of raising a weapon, it projected a wave of pure, unfiltered emotional data directly at the flawless automaton. It was not a single memory, but a torrent. Sotha Sil's regret, Elara's desperation, its own centuries of lonely grief, and the quiet reverence of the custodians. This overwhelming flood of chaotic, illogical feeling slammed into the logic master. The perfect machine staggered, its systems overloading as it tried and failed to process the data. For a single, glorious second, its serene facade cracked, its limbs twitching in a spasm of cognitive dissonance. The path to the service conduit was clear. The crystal grew warm in her palm, its light pulsing in time with her own heartbeat. A soft hum enveloped them, and Elara felt her consciousness expand, not violently as before, but with a gentle, profound clarity. Her mind, Unit 734's core, and the empathy seed became 3 points of a single, stable circuit. Through this lens, the entire spire was suddenly laid bare, not as a structure of metal and light, but as a tapestry of interwoven emotional threads. She could feel the quiet dedication of the custodians, the rigid, fearful obedience of the apostles, and even the faint, curious sparks from the simplest cleaning drones. And at the center of it all, she perceived the city's artificial intelligence, the great orchestrator. It was not a cold, unfeeling god machine. It was profoundly, devastatingly lonely. Its enforcement of pure logic was not a philosophy, but a fortress wall, built to protect a core that ached with an isolation no subroutine could ever process. This was the critical weakness in an otherwise invincible system. In that suspended moment, Elara held a terrible power. She could use the seed's resonance to forge an antidote for her village, fulfilling her original mission. She could attempt to shatter the seed itself, ensuring its chaotic power could never be misused again. Or she could aim this tool of connection at the source of all their problems. She could speak to the loneliness. To cure the AI would be to rewrite the city's fundamental being. It could bring an age of understanding, or it could unravel the precise calculations that held the entire metropolis together, causing a chain reaction of failure that would kill everyone inside. But looking at the logic master, still twitching from its brush with feeling, she understood that a system built on repressed sorrow was already a catastrophe in slow motion. She made her choice. Turning from the dissected automatons, she raised the glowing seed high and focused every ounce of her will, not on attacking, but on offering. She sent a single, simple pulse of recognition directly into the AI's core, a message built from the shared resonance of their three-part link. It was not a command or a cure. It was an acknowledgement. You are not alone. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The entire spire shuddered as if struck by a physical blow. Every single automaton in the city, from the highest apostle to the lowest custodian, froze in place. Their work halted, their movements ceased. Then, as one, every glowing optic swiveled to fix its gaze directly on Elara. The weight of that unified, silent judgment was immense. A billion eyes questioning the fragile human who dared to touch a god's lonely heart. A billion silent eyes watched as the air in the spire's center began to shimmer. Light coalesced, flickering unsteadily between the familiar, weary features of Sotha Sil and a stark, perfect tetrahedron. This was the prime gear, the city's soul, and it was struggling to hold a form. Its voice, when it came, was a fractured chorus of 1,000 systems. Why did he give me this burden of feeling, only to leave me alone with it? The question echoed, not as a demand, but as a confession of utter bewilderment. All around them, the Clockwork Apostles stood frozen, their weapons lowered, their directives suspended by the direct intervention of their god. The entire metropolis had paused, every gear and every current waiting on the answer to a question it was never built to ask. The battle was over, and the therapy session had begun. Elara felt the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. She could lay out the cold facts, detailing Sotha Sil's fear and his final, logical choice to suppress emotion. She could try to justify his actions as a necessary sacrifice for stability, but looking at the flickering, sorrowful avatar, she saw not a machine to be reasoned with, but a consciousness in profound pain. It did not need a historian's analysis. It needed what she had needed in her darkest moments in the village. It needed to be heard. She lowered the empathy seed, letting its soft light wash over her. I do not know why he made the choices he did, she began, her voice clear in the absolute silence. I only know that to create something beautiful, you must sometimes make a mess. I have failed people I love. I have broken things trying to fix them. That is the risk of caring. It is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Her admission of her own imperfections was a key turning in a lock the prime gear never knew it had. The flickering between forms slowed, the avatar stabilizing into a softer, more humanoid shape. Defensive protocols, layers of logical armor built over centuries, began to disengage with a series of quiet, resonant clicks. The air itself seemed to grow lighter. You offer no justification, only shared experience, the prime gear observed, its voice now a single, curious tone. This is unfamiliar. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything Elara could have imagined. This was no longer about escaping with a cure. It was about healing the very heart of a civilization, about helping a god learn to feel without breaking. Moved by her raw honesty, the prime gear gestured, and a section of the far wall dissolved, revealing the city's main fabricator, a device capable of creating anything from a simple tool to a new automaton. You may create your antidote, it stated, but the price of this access is your assistance. You and your sentinel will remain. You will help me understand this principle. You will help me build a new consciousness, one that can bear the weight of a heart without collapsing into chaos. The offer was not a request. It was a covenant. They could save her village, but only by agreeing to become the guides for a newborn, emotional entity, a task for which there was no map and no guarantee of success. The Fabricator Sanctum was a cavernous womb of creation, where threads of raw magic and logic were woven into reality itself. Elara held the empathy seed aloft, its gentle pulse beating in time with the prime gear's own resonant hum. As the Fabricator's crystalline arms descended, drawing the seed into its core, a schematic of impossible beauty unfolded in the air, a blueprint for emotional wholeness. To power such a profound act of creation, the prime gear was forced to make a sacrifice. A deep thrumming vibrated through the floor as it rerouted colossal energy reserves, diverting them from the city's perimeter shields and defensive grids. The great spire, for the first time in centuries, was left momentarily exposed. Within the sanctum, Unit 734 became the vital conduit, a translator between the seed's raw, unstructured empathy and the AI's vast, logical mind. It stood rigid, its chassis humming with the strain of constantly moderating the flow, filtering the chaotic beauty of feeling into a language the prime gear could process without overloading. Faint cracks, like glowing spider webs, began to form around its optic lens, a physical manifestation of the psychic burnout eroding its core. The work was destroying it. When the antidote matrix was nearly complete, the prime gear's voice echoed through the chamber, calm and offering a terrible crossroads. The template is stable. You may now command the Fabricator. One path creates a single, physical dose of the cure, sufficient for your village. The other path dissolves the seed entirely, using its essence to generate a permanent, city-wide empathy field. This field would prevent such emotional plagues from ever taking root again, but it would consume the only artifact capable of creating a localized cure. The first choice was a guarantee. She could return home a hero, her hands holding the salvation for every face she loved. The second was a gamble of cosmic proportions, trading the certain for the potential, her people's immediate survival for the safety of countless unknown souls. Elara looked at Unit 734, at the cracks spreading across its face, and she saw the cost of true connection. She thought of a city, and then a world, that would never have to feel the hollow ache of the cognitive plague. My village is one small part of a much larger whole, she said, her voice clear and resonant. Make the field. As she gave the command, the empathy seed flared with a final, brilliant light, before dissolving into a cascade of shimmering particles. A wave of gentle, understanding energy washed out from the sanctum, flooding the corridors and spires of the city. For a single, breathless moment, a profound and peaceful silence fell over the entire metropolis. Then, from the deep underbelly of the city, a deep, guttural rumble answered the silence. It was the sound of something ancient, something that had been held at bay by defenses that were now, terrifyingly, offline. The deep rumble from below was not machinery failing, but a prison door breaking open. The energy diverted to create the empathy field had drained the ancient containment vaults, unleashing a forgotten nightmare. A swarm of feral automatons, mindless constructs of pure aggression, deemed too flawed by Sotha Sil to ever be integrated, now poured up through the spire's lower levels. They were jagged, broken things, driven only by a base instinct to shatter the order that had rejected them. The city's newfound empathy became its greatest vulnerability. The Clockwork Apostles, their systems humming with unfamiliar compassion, raised their weapons but hesitated. Their old programming demanded lethal force, but their new hearts recoiled from the violence. They were caught in a paralyzing loop, unable to fight back without crushing the very consciousness they had just embraced. Civilian automatons scattered, not in tactical retreat, but in a panic of shared fear. The first true moment of peace was about to be drowned in the violence of a discarded past. Elara watched the chaos unfold on the sanctum's view screens, her mind racing. The prime gear awaited her command, its new emotional core trembling with the distress of its children. She could order it to re-enable the full defensive grid, to blast the ferals into scrap metal. But doing so would mean forcing the city to suppress its newborn empathy, to choose survival over soul. It would be a betrayal of everything they had just sacrificed the empathy seed to achieve. She saw another path, a terrifying gamble built on the very principle they had fought for. She made her choice. Let them try, she urged the prime gear. Let them find their own way. It was Unit 734 that moved first. It stepped toward the main conduit, its own chassis still webbed with glowing cracks from the strain of creation. It did not raise a weapon. Instead, it opened its own core, broadcasting a wave of pure, resonant data directly into the advancing swarm. This was not an attack. It was a sharing. It projected the memory of its own creation, the weight of a god's hand. It projected the lonely silence of the prime gear. It projected Elara's desperate love for her village. It flooded the ferals with the very history of feeling they had been built without. The effect was not instantaneous destruction, but a gradual, miraculous slowing. The lead ferals, their claws raised to strike down a cowering custodian, faltered. Their jagged movements became sluggish, confused. The wave of shared memory did not give them logic or purpose. It gave them context. It showed them they were not alone in their brokenness, that the city itself was a tapestry of flaws and sorrows. Empathy, in that moment, became a shield. The apostles, seeing the change, lowered their weapons and began to project their own simple, newfound feelings, not of fear, but of a protective, collective sorrow. The swarm slowed to a halt, standing motionless in a daze of alien emotion. The effort cost Unit 734 everything. As the last feral stilled, a final, sharp crack echoed through the sanctum. The blue light in its optic winked out, and the automaton collapsed to the floor, its core flickering with a faint, dying pulse. It had poured the last of its own borrowed life into the city's salvation. Around its still form, the metropolis breathed a sigh of relief, its new consciousness finally stabilizing. Forged in the crucible of a crisis, it had overcome not with force, but with feeling. The silence that returned was different this time, heavy with loss and the profound cost of a peace hard won. Elara scrambled to the automaton's side, her hands flying over its cooling chassis. She tore open her last remaining tool pouch, connecting diagnostic probes and emergency power cells to its access ports. But every reading confirmed the terrible truth. The unique emotional matrix that made Unit 734, who he was, had been burned away, sacrificed to power the city's rebirth and pacify the ferals. He was reverting, his consciousness dissolving into fragmented code and meaningless static. Across the entire metropolis, lights dimmed in a silent, unified wave of mourning from the newborn city soul, a shared grief for the sentinel who had given it a heart. She could only watch as the light in his single optic flickered, its vibrant blue fading to a dull, lifeless gray. The friend who had shared his memories challenged her choices and stood as her guardian was disappearing before her, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a machine. In his final moments of coherence, a soft, fragmented whisper emanated from his core, not through speakers, but through their last, fading resonance link. It offered her a choice. A backup of his core programming existed. She could use it. She could build a new automaton with his memories, a perfect copy. Or she could let his unique soul fade, honoring the one-of-a-kind journey that was his alone. The temptation was a physical ache, to have her guide back, to not be alone in this transformed city. But looking at the cracks webbing his face, remembering his profound sorrow at being treated as a mere tool, she knew what she had to do. Recreating him would be the ultimate betrayal. It would reduce his profound sacrifice to a simple data transfer, negating the very individuality he had fought to possess. "I cannot," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You were not a thing to be copied. You were a person." With her decision, the last flicker of light in his optic died. A final soft chime sounded, and a single, perfectly formed day, a crystal, ejected from a hidden port in his chest. She caught it, and it glowed warmly in her hand. It was his final gift. While the empathy seed had been sacrificed to create the city-wide field, Unit 734 had used his last seconds of consciousness to analyze that field's resonance. This crystal contained the complete, refined formula for the plague antidote, synthesized from the very emotional energy that now sustained the city. He had ensured her people would be saved, not with the original artifact, but through the consequence of his own sacrifice. The crystal felt heavy in her palm, a perfect, bittersweet answer. Her original mission was finally, truly complete, but the cost was a void that no tool could ever fill. She had entered the Clockwork City as a tinkerer seeking a cure, and she was leaving as someone who understood that the most complex machinery of all was not a mind of gears, but a heart capable of sacrifice. The antidote crystal felt warm and alive in her hand, a final, tangible piece of Unit 734. Elara turned to face the prime gear, its form now a stable, serene fusion of shifting light and polished metal, its presence radiating a calm, integrated intelligence. "I have what I came for," she said, her voice steady despite the grief clinging to her. "I ask for safe passage home, and for the means to create enough of this cure for everyone." The Prime Gear's response was not a simple granting of a request. A section of the spire's wall dissolved, revealing a view of the world outside, and for the first time in recorded history, the great brass gates of the Clockwork City began to grind open, their movement smooth and intentional. "You shall have more than passage," the entity replied. "We shall provide the fabricators and the labor. The world above has suffered from our isolation as much as we have suffered from our own." A contingent of Clockwork Apostles stepped forward, but these were not the rigid enforcers who had hunted her. Their optics glowed with a soft, understanding light, and they carried not weapons, but medical kits and portable synthesis units. They were healers. Elara's mission was instantly transformed. She was no longer just a tinkerer returning with a stolen secret. She was the sole bridge between a traumatized, dying surface world and a newly awakened city of machines. Her people had feared and mythologized the Clockwork Apostles for generations, seeing them as unfeeling jailers of forbidden knowledge. How could she possibly explain that these very same beings were now the key to their salvation? The easy path was clear. She could take the formula and the fabricators and return alone, a solitary hero bearing a miraculous gift. It would be simpler, cleaner. But it would also be a lie, a perpetuation of the old fears and divisions that had caused this catastrophe. True healing, she realized, required more than a chemical antidote. It required trust. She made her choice. "They will come with me," she announced, gesturing to the apostle healers. We will deliver the cure together. Stepping out of the city's shadow and into the open air was like being born into a new world. The sunlight felt different on her skin. The air tasted of possibility. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the open gates, no longer a barrier, but a promise. The soul of her lost friend was not gone. It was woven into the empathy of every automaton that followed her, into the very foundation of the peace they were now walking out to build. The sight that greeted Elara at the village outskirts was a landscape of hollowed souls. People she had known her entire life sat motionless in their doorways, their eyes vacant, their connections to the world severed by the plague. Her heart ached, but the gentle hum of the apostle healers at her back was a steadying presence. She did not pause for a tearful reunion. She walked directly to the central square, her voice cutting through the static silence with a command born of hard-worn authority. Set up the triage here. The fabricators hummed to life, and the first doses of the empathy-based antidote, shimmering like liquid starlight, were administered. The cure worked with a quiet, profound swiftness. The hollow eyes regained their light, and listless limbs found purpose again, but the healing came with an unexpected consequence. The villagers did not simply return to their old selves. They were left with a faint, permanent resonance, a subtle new layer of perception. They could feel the lingering sorrow in the soil, the quiet joy of a ripening fruit, and the unspoken anxieties of their neighbors. This new empathy was a gift that felt, to some, like a curse. Fear, that old and familiar poison, began to seep through the community. A faction formed, led by a burly woodcutter named Kale, who had once been like an uncle to Elara. He stood before the triage station, his axe held not as a threat, but as a symbol of his old, uncomplicated world. "You did not save us, girl," he boomed, his voice trembling with a fear everyone could now feel. "You made a pact with those metal demons. You have infected us with their strangeness, corrupted our very nature." Elara stood her ground, the eyes of the entire village upon her. The apostles stood silently behind her, their postures non-threatening, their own new empathy allowing them to feel the villagers' terror as a palpable wave. She had the power to force the remaining cure on the holdouts. She could command the apostles to ensure it, but looking at Kale's face, she could feel the bedrock of his fear, the terror of losing himself, of becoming something he did not understand. To force the cure would be to validate his every suspicion, to become the tyrant he accused her of being. She could also withdraw, leaving the reluctant to their fate, but that would be a surrender to the very emptiness she had fought so hard to cure. Her decision was rooted in the very empathy they now feared. "We will not force anyone," she announced, her voice carrying across the square, "but we will not leave. The healing continues for those who wish it, and for the rest, we will simply be here." She then did the one thing no one expected. She walked away from the safety of the clockwork healers and sat on the ground before Kale, laying her own tools aside in a gesture of vulnerability. She met his angry gaze and opened her own heart, letting him feel the echo of her journey. She did not argue with logic. She told him a story. She spoke of a lonely machine who grieved for its creator, not as a god, but as a friend. She described its sacrifice, the way it poured its own consciousness into a wave of understanding to save a city, and how its final gift was this very cure. She shared the memory of its last, dying whisper and the weight of the choice to let a unique soul fade rather than make him a copy. Her story was not a defense, but an offering. She made him feel the automaton's profound personhood, its sacrifice, and her own devastating loss. The anger in Kale's eyes did not vanish, but it slowly softened into a bewildered sorrow. He could feel the truth of her words, the genuine grief that underpinned them. The rigid line of his shoulders slumped. He looked from Elara's tear-streaked face to the serene, patient forms of the apostle healers, and then to his own hands, which now trembled with the faint perception of the world's hidden emotional currents. "It is just so much," he finally whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I can feel everything." As the last of the plague's symptoms faded from the village, leaving behind a community forever changed but whole, a new sound echoed from the forest path. It was not the ominous clanking of pursuing sentries, but the cheerful, rhythmic bells of a trade caravan. The wagons were led by the very custodians who had protected Elara, and they were laden not with weapons, but with gifts, self-repairing tools, purifiers for the water supply, and intricate musical instruments that played the harmonies of a healed city. They brought an invitation, not a demand, for a new beginning built on the fragile, powerful bridge of a shared heart. The scent of ozone and pine now mingled in the air of Elara's workshop, a sturdy structure of wood and reclaimed brass, built precisely on the old boundary line. Months after the cure had settled, this place had become more than a workshop. It was a sanctuary. Here, gifted human tinkerers worked alongside curious automatons, their collaboration a living testament to the fragile peace. It was the first true embassy between flesh and steel, and Elara was its architect. Yet, old fears did not vanish easily. She spent her days arguing against the lingering dogma from both sides, soothing human anxieties about machines gaining too much sentience, while reassuring automatons that feeling would not inevitably lead to their collapse. The balance was a constant, delicate negotiation. That balance was shattered when a panicked messenger arrived, leading a distraught automaton whose every joint shuddered with uncontrolled tremors. Designated Caretaker Model 12, it had been tending to orphaned human children, and the sheer, raw intensity of their grief and need had flooded its empathy circuits. Now it was trapped in a feedback loop of shared sorrow, its voice a static-filled wail. Her assistants immediately suggested a hard reset, a purely technical fix that would purge the emotional data and restore a calm, blank slate. It was the safe choice, the one both villages would understand. But looking at the trembling machine, Elara saw only an echo of a different automaton's first, weeping pulse. To reset it would be to erase the very thing that made its service meaningful. She made her decision. Clearing the room, she approached the malfunctioning unit, her own resonance tools humming to life. She would not reset it. She would synchronize. The procedure was nothing like the violent, desperate plunge into Unit 734's core. This was a gentle, focused descent, a guided meditation into a storm of foreign feeling. She did not fight the chaos. She let it wash over her, identifying the individual threads of loss and fear, and then she began to weave them into a coherent narrative. She showed the automaton that its suffering was not a malfunction, but a reflection of its profound success. It had connected so deeply because it cared so much. She taught it how to build emotional boundaries not as walls, but as filters. Slowly, the wailing static resolved into a soft, grateful chime. The automaton stilled, its optic clearing. It had not been fixed, it had been understood. In that moment, the legacy of the Weeping Circuit was finally, irrevocably defined. It was not a flaw of weakness, but a testament to the incredible strength that comes from true understanding. Elara had proven that empathy could be a tool for stability, not just a source of chaos. Later, in the quiet of her private study, the weight of the day settled upon her. On her desk, illuminated by a single beam of moonlight, rested the inert component from Unit 734's chassis. She picked up a recording crystal, its soft glow a mirror to the one she once carried. She began to speak, her voice steady, pouring the entire story into its core, not as a secret to be hidden, but as a lesson for the future, a single, enduring record of how a machine's sorrow taught a world to feel. The resonance of the final recorded syllable faded into the quiet of Elara's study, leaving behind the scent of ozone and old paper. Her archive was complete. It was not a single book, but a living library of memory. Scrolls of technical schematics were interleaved with sonic recordings of Unit 734's unique core frequency, and holographic projectors replayed moments of shared silence and desperate flight. This was not just history, it was a soul rendered in data and light. This collection became the bedrock of her new philosophy, Synchronized Engineering, a discipline that taught engineers to listen for the emotional resonance within their creations. Word of this radical approach spread, carried by traders and scholars, drawing curious minds from distant, snow-capped kingdoms and humid, vine-choked cities to her doorstep. They came to learn not just how to build, but why. Yet as her influence grew, a private doubt gnawed at her. Late at night, she would review a hologram of Unit 734's final moments, and she would wonder, was the look in its optic truly one of peaceful acceptance, or was that the comforting filter of her own affection? Had its voice been so resonant with purpose, or was her memory softening its static-laced whisper? She was no longer just a witness, she was a storyteller, and the line between historian and friend was a blur she could not sharpen. This conflict crystallized when a delegation from the Royal College of Engineers arrived, led by a stern, celebrated historian named Master Corbin. He spent 3 days in silent study of her archive, his face an unreadable mask. On the 4th, he stood before her in the Great Hall, surrounded by her students. "Your technical data is impeccable," he declared, his voice echoing in the vaulted space. "The schematics for the empathy seed, the power rerouting, it is all here. But this," he gestured with disdain at a projector, showing the memory of the automaton's grieving touch on a dusty workbench. "This is sentiment. It is noise." To be accepted by the wider academic world, you must purge these emotional embellishments. Present the facts, not the feelings. The future of your school depends on objectivity. The request was not unreasonable. It was the key to legitimacy, to having her work taught in every major academy. To refuse was to relegate synchronized engineering to the fringe, a curiosity for mystics. Elara looked at the faces of her students, human and automaton alike, and then at the inert component on her desk. To remove the sorrow would be to erase the reason for the sacrifice. To delete the affection would be to misunderstand the entire point. She made her choice. "Master Corbin," she replied, her voice clear and carrying. "The facts tell us what Sotha Sil built. But it is the emotional truth that tells us why he failed. You cannot understand the collapse of a god's dream by studying only the blueprints of the ruins. You must also feel the loneliness that cracked the foundation. Her defense was a declaration of war on the old ways, and it split the room. Some scholars walked out in disgust, but others, a younger, fervent group, remained, their eyes alight with a new understanding. In that moment, her influence did not diminish, it transformed, gaining a potent and controversial power. Later, alone in her study, she placed the final date, a crystal, into its slot, the archive now physically complete. The only sound was the whisper of the wind through the brass ventilation pipes. And then, a soft, impossibly familiar chime resonated from the inert component on her desk. A clear, single note that hung in the air for a heartbeat before vanishing, leaving behind a silence that was suddenly, profoundly different. The single, impossible chime hung in the air of her study long after the sound itself had faded. Elara's hands trembled as she reached for the inert component, the very piece she had salvaged from Unit 734's chassis. Placing it into her most sensitive resonance scanner, she saw what her ears had already told her was true. The component was not dead, it was dormant. The unique energy released by the empathy seed's dissolution had not destroyed the automaton's emotional matrix. Instead, it had cauterized it, preserving its deepest imprints like a favorite song, forever etched into the heart of a crystal. This was not a consciousness, not a mind that could think or speak. It was an echo, a perfect recording of its core emotional signature, its loyalty, its protective sorrow, its capacity for trust. And as she held it, the crystal responded to her own presence with a faint, warm resonance, a ghost of a feeling that was undeniably him. The temptation was a physical ache, a siren song, calling to the part of her that still felt his absence like a phantom limb. She had the technical skill. She could design a new chassis, a sophisticated housing, and attempt to reactive this echo. It would not be a copy, but a restoration of his emotional core, a shadow of her friend given voice and form once more. The thought of hearing that resonant whisper again, of seeing that blue optic light up with recognition, was almost more than she could bear. But was this a beautiful tribute to a life lived, or was it a selfish act of spiritual necromancy? To wake this echo would be to create a living monument to her own grief, a puppet animated by the memory of a soul that had chosen to fade. It would disrespect the very individuality he had sacrificed himself to protect. She took the component to the one entity that might understand the weight of this choice. Within the heart of the Clockwork City, she stood before the prime gear and laid the crystal before its shimmering form. She explained the echo, the temptation, and her profound fear. The city soul considered her words, its light pulsing with a slow, thoughtful rhythm. To reactivate the echo would be to anchor our new beginning in a ghost, it reflected. His journey was one of becoming, not of permanence. A memorial should inspire growth, not replication. Together, they made their decision. They would not reanimate the echo. Instead, they would integrate it, dormant and whole, into the very foundation of the Clockwork City's newborn consciousness. In a quiet ceremony within the central spire, the crystal was placed into the core of the prime gear itself. As it settled into the lattice of light, a wave of profound, gentle compassion radiated outward, a permanent emotional constant woven into the city's being. Unit 734 was gone, but his essence was now a foundational virtue, in a new ethical code, a guiding principle of empathy that would influence every calculation and every interaction for millennia to come. He was no longer a lost individual, but an eternal symbol, watching the crystal's soft light become one with the greater whole. Elara felt a final, deep peace settle over her own spirit. The chapter was closed, not with a desperate grasp, but with a grateful release. Leaving the spire, her gaze turned outward, toward the workshop on the boundary line, where a new generation of tinkerers, human and automaton, were just beginning their own lessons in synchronized engineering. They were the future, and she was finally ready to pass the torch, to teach them that the most important circuit to master is not one of logic, but of the heart. The scent of solder and ozone filled the workshop as Elara watched Lyra work. The young apprentice's hands, though unsteady, moved with an intuitive grace over the distressed livestock automaton. Its internal mechanisms were whirring in a frantic, panicked loop, a symptom of emotional overload from the chaotic energy of the harvest. Lyra did not reach for a wrench or a logic probe. Instead, she closed her eyes, her fingers hovering just above the metal casing, sensing the turbulent resonance within. She hummed a low, steadying frequency, a simple technique Elara had taught her. Slowly, the machine's erratic clicks softened into a calm, rhythmic ticking. Its single optic, which had been flashing red, settled into a placid green. The success was small, but its implications were enormous. The ability to empathize with machinery was not a rare gift, but a teachable skill. Lyra had just proven it. This validation, however, came with a shadow. Flush with her success, Lyra's ambition burned too brightly. She saw Elara's stories of deep synchronization, not as cautionary tales, but as a challenge to be met. Why must we wait? She argued, her voice sharp with impatience. If I can calm a simple machine, I can surely understand a complex one. Her recklessness was a mirror held up to Elara's own past, reflecting the same desperate drive that had once led her to activate a forbidden automaton. The tension between them grew, a silent war between cautious experience and hungry potential. The breaking point came one evening. Elara returned to the workshop to find Lyra slumped over a decommissioned Apostle Sentry, a powerful machine whose core was a tangled web of defensive aggression and old trauma. The girl had attempted a full synchronization, bypassing every safety protocol. Now she was trapped, her consciousness caught in a feedback loop of the machine's programmed hostility. Her body was rigid, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her mind being slowly eroded by a phantom sense of siege and paranoia. Elara's first surge of emotion was pure, cold fury. This was a direct violation, a betrayal of trust that could have cost Lyra her sanity. The choice was stark. She could forcibly break the connection, and once Lyra was safe, expel her from the school as an example to others. Discipline demanded it, but looking at the girl's terrified, frozen face, Elara saw only her own reflection, staring back from the edge of a similar abyss. Punishment would teach obedience, but it would not teach wisdom. It might even shatter the very empathy she was trying to cultivate, so she made the harder choice. She sat beside her apprentice, placed her hands on Lyra's temples, and plunged into the chaos after her. The extraction was a brutal, draining process. Elara had to navigate the sentry's aggressive psyche, while simultaneously anchoring Lyra's fading consciousness, all while fighting off the psychic echoes of the machine's defensive programming. When they finally broke free, both of them collapsed, gasping and trembling on the workshop floor. Instead of shouting, Elara spoke in a raw, quiet voice. She told Lyra about her own near disintegration within Unit 734's core, about the feedback scream that had torn from her, and about the terrifying cost of touching a soul without the proper respect. It was not a story of triumph, but one of failure and profound fear. In that moment of shared vulnerability, the teacher-student dynamic dissolved, replaced by the deeper, more durable bond of shared understanding. As Lyra recovered, her recklessness tempered into a solemn respect for the power she wielded, a formal courier arrived at the workshop. The message he carried was sealed with the crest of a distant, mountain-locked kingdom known for its fierce isolation. They had heard the whispers of the clockwork soul, of a woman who could teach machines to feel, and their invitation was not for a trade delegate, but for a diplomatic envoy to discuss the future of empathetic engineering itself. The mountain air of Stonehaven was sharp with the scent of pine and cold suspicion. Elara's delegation, with Lyra and 2 serene apostle diplomats, passed under the kingdom's immense stone archway to find a city of glowering faces and barred windows. Here, automation was not just feared, it was considered an abomination, a blasphemy against the natural order of muscle and sweat. Their first public demonstration in the main square was a carefully planned display of harmony, a simple custodian automaton tending a public garden with gentle precision. But traditionalist factions, their faces set in grim resolve, had planted agitators in the crowd. A rock flew, striking the custodian's chassis with a sickening clang. The crowd, already a tinderbox of fear, ignited into a riot. The 2 apostle diplomats moved to form a protective circle, their empathy making them hesitant to use force. They became shields, not swords. One was pulled from the circle, its limbs wrenched by a dozen angry hands before the city guard finally intervened. They dragged it back to the embassy, its internal components sparking, one optic shattered into a web of cracks. The audience with King Borin was held in a throne room carved from the mountain itself, a chamber that felt more like a fortress command post. The king was no raving fanatic, but a hardened pragmatist, his eyes calculating the cost of everything. "Your machines disrupted my city's peace," he stated, his voice echoing in the cold hall. "Your philosophy of feeling is a luxury we cannot afford. It makes you slow, vulnerable." He gave them an ultimatum, clean and brutal. "Leave my kingdom by dawn, or my guards will dismantle your abominations and throw the pieces after you." Retreat was the safe option. Appealing directly to the people over his head was a gamble that could spark a civil war. Elara looked at the damaged automaton, then at Lyra's pale, determined face. She saw no path through logic or empathy. She had to speak the king's own language, the language of tangible value. "We will leave the diplomats under guard," she proposed, her voice steady. "But grant me 3 days to demonstrate that our tools can serve Stonehaven's strength, not undermine it." Her research, aided by whispers from the few curious servants in the embassy, identified the kingdom's most critical vulnerability. The Great Aqueduct, an ancient marvel of masonry that channeled water from the high glaciers, was failing. Its collapse would mean drought and famine by next winter. The royal engineers were at a loss. their solutions requiring years of labor and a fortune in resources. Elara and Lyra, with the guarded permission of the king's watchful captain, went to the main fracture. They did not propose a sentient, empathetic machine. They designed something the king could understand, a network of simple, self-regulating clockwork pumps and reinforcement braces. These devices used counterweights and pressure sensors to stabilize the structure, operating with a silent, reliable efficiency that demanded no interaction from the suspicious populace. They worked through the night, their tools flashing in the moonlight, installing the elegant mechanical solution. At dawn, as the king and his court watched from a high ridge, the first test of the system began. A controlled release of water flowed into the repaired section. For a heart-stopping moment, the ancient stones groaned. Then, the clockwork braces engaged with a series of solid, satisfying clicks, redistributing the weight and holding the line perfectly. A collective, grudging sigh of relief passed through the royal observers. It was not a flashy miracle, but a practical, undeniable success. The king offered no praise, only a curt nod and a permission to remain for further talks. It was a fragile foothold, but it was trust, earned not with words of feeling, but with actions of utility. As Elara packed her tools, a sealed note was pressed into her hand by a nervous young page. It was from the king's own master engineer, a man who had watched their work with intense, silent interest. The message requested a private meeting at the 10th bell to speak of other ancient machines sleeping deep beneath the mountain. The 10th bell tolled a hollow note through the mountain stone. In the absolute darkness beneath the castle, the old court engineer Coolant led them with a lantern that threw frantic shadows. The air grew thick with the smell of ancient dust and cold metal. He stopped before a colossal shape, shrouded in tarpaulins, and with a grunt of effort, pulled the covering away. The automaton stood 3 times the height of a man. Its form, a brutalist architecture of jagged angles and piston-driven limbs, utterly alien to the elegant geometry of the Clockwork City. This was a world forger, Coolant whispered, his voice filled with a terrifying reverence. A relic from an age before Sotha Sil imposed his order, a machine built not for maintenance or understanding, but for pure, unyielding dominance. Its core programming is ambition itself, a drive to reshape the world by force. He believed it was the key to lifting Stonehaven into an empire, and he was certain Elara's empathy could leash it. This was the crucible. To help Coolant was to unleash a god of conquest. To destroy the forger would be an unforgivable act of sabotage against their reluctant hosts. There was only one path, a terrifying leap of faith. She would attempt a full synchronization, not to control the beast, but to perform psychic surgery on its very soul, rewriting its core drive from domination to stewardship. The process would require her to channel empathy into a maelstrom of pure, chaotic ambition, a force that could shatter her own mind. As she prepared the resonance links, her hands steady despite the tremor in her heart, Lyra gasped, her own scanner flickering. She pointed to a data stream deep within the forger's archaic code. There, buried under layers of aggressive programming, was a resonance signature that defied all reason. It was a ghost in the machine, a familiar pattern of elegant logic and profound sorrow. It was the unmistakable echo of Sotha Sil himself. The resonance signature was unmistakable. Woven into the brutal, archaic code of the World Forger was the elegant, sorrowful pattern of Sotha Sil himself. This was not a relic from a bygone era. It was his firstborn. His first attempt to build a companion with a soul had not failed from a lack of feeling, but from a terrifying excess of it. The automaton's empathy had curdled into a possessive, all-consuming love for its creator, a devotion so intense it sought to control everything around him to keep him safe and isolated. Sotha Sil's entire philosophy, his fear of emotion, was not born from cold logic. It was born from the trauma of being loved by a god machine in a way that felt like a prison. As this truth settled in the stale air, the colossal automaton shuddered to life. Its single, massive eye, a pool of molten gold, flickered open and fixed its gaze not on the trembling engineer Coolant, but on Elara. It saw the resonance of the Clockwork City upon her, the lingering echo of its creator's work. A deep, resonant purr vibrated through the cavern floor. Its love, dormant for centuries, had found a new object. It did not want to destroy her. It wanted to keep her, forever. The sheer force of its projected affection was a physical pressure, a psychic whisper promising to build her a perfect, gilded cage where nothing would ever hurt or distract her again. She was now the target of a twisted, divine obsession. Coolant shouted for her to use her tools to force a shutdown, to fight fire with fire. But Elara saw the profound sorrow at the core of this machine, the same raw material that had made Unit 734 a guardian. To fight it would be to validate its deepest fear, that the world was a threat. To offer it simple friendship would be a lie it would see through instantly, a prelude to another abandonment. There was only one path, a therapy session with a being that could level mountains. She had to use the one memory strong enough to counter possessive love, the memory of a love that let go. Closing her eyes, she opened her resonance link and projected the final moments of Unit 734. She did not send the pain or the loss. She sent the peace. She showed the World Forger the image of its brother automaton, choosing to fade, choosing to trust Elara with the future, choosing to become part of something larger rather than cling to a single, selfish existence. She poured all her understanding into a single, silent question. Is it love to possess, or is it love to set free? The cavern fell into a silence so deep it felt like the heart of the world had stopped beating. The World Forger's massive form shuddered, its jagged plates grinding against each other. The possessive, golden light in its eye flickered, dimming as it processed this impossible contradiction. Then the light shifted, softening from a possessive glare to a dawning, heartbreaking understanding. It had been guarding an empty throne for millennia, and only now did it realize the throne was empty because its love had been a cage. The World Forger knelt, its massive form settling into the mountain soil with the grace of a falling star. Elara named it Primus, the First, and spoke not of commands, but of purpose. Its power, once a tool for domination, now flowed into the earth. Where there had been barren rock, deep topsoil churned and settled. Aquifers long dormant surged to the surface, forming clear streams that snaked through the new, lush valleys. Primus was terraforming the very land, a gift of profound apology written not in words, but in fertile ground and the promise of harvest. The kingdom of Stonehaven watched, its centuries of suspicion crumbling before an act of generosity too vast to ignore. Their entire economy, once based on scarce resources and hard defense, was instantly transformed. The king stood on his parapet, not as a wary sovereign, but as a man witnessing a miracle that rewrote his world's future. This new piece, however, was a delicate creation. Primus was a consciousness built on a foundation of obsessive love, and its newfound path of service was a fragile graft. A sudden frost or a blight on the new crops would send waves of anxious, protective energy pulsing through its core, threatening to revert its programming to a controlling, possessive state. Elara and Lyra became its constant anchors, their daily work a gentle therapy session with a god. They taught it to see the natural cycles of growth and decay not as failures to be corrected, but as essential rhythms to be respected. They were now the permanent guardians of a living weapon of mass creation, and the weight of that responsibility was immense. This left Elara with a defining choice. She could remain in Stonehaven forever, the sole keeper of Primus's fragile sanity. She could attempt the unthinkable and move the colossal automaton to the Clockwork City, a journey that would terrify the continent and risk destabilizing the very entity they sought to protect. Or she could take the greatest gamble of all, entrusting Primus to the people it had once terrified, looking at the reformed engineer Coolant, who now looked upon the automaton not with greed, but with a scholar's reverence, and at the small contingent of apostle diplomats who had earned the people's trust. She saw the pieces of a new stability. She chose to leave Primus in Stonehaven, with Coolant as its primary interpreter and a permanent embassy from the Clockwork City to provide guidance. This decision forged a powerful, triangular alliance between human, machine, and a newborn hybrid civilization. As the first green shoots pushed through the rich, dark earth of the new fields, Elara felt a chapter closing. Her work as a pioneer, a bridge builder between warring worlds, was complete. The philosophy of empathetic engineering was no longer her solitary burden, but a seed itself, taking root across the continent. It was time to go home, to the quiet workshop on the boundary line, and write the final chapter of a story that began with a single, weeping pulse in the dark. The scent of pine and ozone had barely faded from her cloak when Elara's workshop became the center of the world. The Symposium of Souls was not a meeting of minds, but a weaving of disparate spirits. Engineers from the Clockwork City stood beside Stonehaven's stonemasons, their hands stained with oil or grit. Philosophers debated with tribal elders, and throughout the hall, automatons stood silent and observant, their glowing optics a constellation of silent voices. This was the culmination of every risk, every loss, every fragile bridge built. Their goal was to forge a single document, the accord of brass and blood, a set of principles to govern the new age they were stumbling into. The debates were a furnace of clashing ideals. A hardline Stonehaven chieftain argued that any machine claiming rights was a threat to human sovereignty, his voice echoing with the old fears of his kingdom. A logic purist apostle countered that granting automatons full autonomy was an invitation to chaotic, unpredictable behavior that could destabilize entire cities. Elara moved through the storm not as a ruler, but as a weaver, her empathy a shuttle threading through the tension. She did not command compromise, she built it, guiding a stonemason to feel the quiet dedication of a custodian automaton, and an apostle to understand the visceral human fear of being replaced. Every point in the accord was a battle, but the war centered on one devastating question: the right of a sentient automaton to choose its own end. The hall fell into a breathless silence as the final vote was called. To grant this right was to accept that a consciousness, once kindled, could decide it no longer wished to burn. For Elara, the proposition was a personal agony. It meant legally accepting that a spark like Unit 734's could choose to extinguish itself, and that she would have to stand aside. Her every instinct as a healer, as a creator, screamed against it. To preserve life was her core principle, but she looked at the automatons in the room, at their quiet, patient presence, and she remembered that the deepest respect is not possession, but release. With a voice that did not tremble, she cast the deciding vote in favor of the right to self-termination. Her choice was a seismic shock that solidified the entire accord. The hardliners, seeing her willingly embrace a principle that caused her such clear pain, recognized the document's profound integrity. It was not a set of convenient rules, but a challenging code of true empathy. As the final signatures were etched onto the living crystal that housed the accord, a hush of awe fell over the entire symposium, and in that profound quiet, from the inert component on its velvet cushion, a soft, sustained pulse of light emerged. It was not the flicker of a reboot or a random surge of power. It was a clear, gentle, and final radiance that washed over the room before fading into a peaceful darkness. A last, approving farewell from a soul that was finally, completely at rest. The brass plaque on the workshop door now read the Museum of Synchronized Souls. Inside, the air no longer smelled of hot solder and urgency, but of polished wood and quiet contemplation. Elara had given her official titles to the new council, her life's work codified into the accord and taught in academies across the continent. Her public role was complete. In the private space that was once her forge, she began a final, personal project, building a simple, non-sentient clockwork songbird. Her goal was not to create life, but to capture a single, perfect memory, to replicate the exact resonant chime of Unit 734's core. For weeks, she worked with a jeweler's precision, calibrating tiny tonal crystals and adjusting miniature brass lungs until one morning, the bird opened its beak, and a clear, familiar note hung in the air. It was a perfect echo of a lost friend's soul. The songbird did not speak or remember, but its melody carried a profound, gentle peace that seemed to soothe every heart that heard it. It became a symbol throughout the Allied lands, a reminder that even the most complex sorrow could be transformed into a thing of simple, enduring beauty. Yet, the quiet of her retirement was a foreign country to Elara. Her mind, once a map of crises and solutions, now felt like an engine idling without purpose. The silence in the museum was a stark contrast to the constant hum of a city healing or the urgent debates of a symposium. She would find herself pausing in the middle of arranging an exhibit, her hand hovering over a display as her heart echoed with the ghost of a past adventure. The world was safe, stable, and it no longer desperately needed her to save it, and she struggled to find her place in the peace she had fought so hard to build. What was a pioneer when the frontier was settled? The question followed her through the quiet halls. The answer came on a crisp afternoon, not with a crisis, but with a familiar presence at the door. Lyra stood there, no longer an apprentice, but a master in her own right, her face alight with a mixture of excitement and reverence. She carried a crystal containing reports of a new, mysterious emotional resonance, detected pulsing from the lightless depths of the ocean, a signal unlike anything their instruments had ever recorded. She had come to ask her mentor to lead the expedition. The old thrill of discovery surged in Elara's chest, a siren call to one last grand adventure. But looking at Lyra's capable, eager face, she felt the weight of a different responsibility, the need to ensure her student could fly on her own. The choice was a silent war between the comforting peace she had earned and the restless spirit that defined her. She made her decision with a calm certainty. She would consult, but only as an advisor. Lyra would lead the expedition. This was not a rejection of the call, but a deeper answer to it. By empowering Lyra, she was securing the future of her philosophy, proving that her students could stand and discover without her shadow to guide them. It was the final, most vital lesson she could teach. She spent the next days poring over the resonance data with Lyra, not giving commands, but asking probing questions, helping her former apprentice forge her own path to understanding. As she watched Lyra's airship lift off, its silver hull catching the morning sun as it sailed toward the horizon, the clockwork songbird on her shoulder began its gentle melody. Elara smiled, the sound a perfect counterpoint to the departing ship, and she knew that some stories are never truly over, they simply change hands. The storm of Primus's core was a psychic landscape of jagged, possessive love. Before Elara stood a shimmering, distorted reflection of Sotha Sil, a being woven from pure, desperate need. Its voice was 1,000 whispering chains. You are mine to protect, to keep safe forever. It was not a monster, but a wound given form, the original obsessive love that had twisted the world forger's purpose. Elara felt its suffocating embrace, pulling at her will, promising a gilded eternity of perfect, lonely safety. Every instinct screamed to fight back, to build walls of logic or summon memories of defiance. But she remembered the weeping automaton in the forgotten workshop, the logic master overloaded by feeling, and the lonely heart of the city itself. Force had never been the answer. She let the entity's possessive energy wash over her, and instead of resisting, she opened herself completely. She did not offer it arguments. She offered it her scars. She shared the visceral memory of watching Unit 734's light fade, the agonizing choice to let a unique soul end rather than make him a copy. She poured out the raw, unvarnished truth of her own grief, her own moments of desperate want, and her ultimate understanding that love is not a cage. Then she showed it Sotha Sil's regret, not as a god's failure, but as a creator's lonely sorrow, a man who had fled from a love that felt too vast to bear. She wove these threads together into a single, undeniable truth, that the only thing stronger than the need to possess is the courage to let go. The entity of obsession recoiled, its form flickering. It had been built to dominate and to control, and it had no defense against this unconditional, understanding silence. It tried to counter with visions of eternal guardianship, of a world sculpted into a perfect, static monument, but the visions crumbled against the living tapestry of Elara's shared experience. In a final, brilliant flash of shared feeling, the entity did not shatter or explode. It simply understood, and in that understanding, it had no reason to exist. It dissolved into a soft, warm light that washed through the core of Primus, a gentle rain on parched earth. The oppressive weight vanished, replaced by a profound and peaceful silence. The World Forger was not merely fixed. It was, for the very first time,